You're under arrest." The handcuffs clicked shut around wrists that had once carried a Medal of Honor. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just stared straight ahead with eyes that had seen too much. The courtroom would be packed with people who saw only a homeless man accused of theft. None of them knew that 50 years ago, those same hands had pulled 7 wounded soldiers from a burning helicopter under enemy fire in the jungles of Vietnam. Welcome to Warrior Voice. Before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world you are watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of our community. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of Riverside County Superior Court, each drop a quiet percussion against glass that had witnessed countless human dramas unfold within these walls. October 15th, 2024, a Tuesday that would begin like any other in the small courthouse that served 3 rural communities nestled in the hills east of Los Angeles. James Morrison sat in the defendant's chair, his weathered hands resting on the table before him. At 74, his frame still carried the military bearing that 50 years of civilian life hadn't quite erased, though the sharp edges had been worn smooth by time and circumstance. His gray hair, longer than it had ever been during his service years, was clean but unkempt. The orange jumpsuit he wore hung loose on a frame that had once been muscular but now spoke of too many missed meals and too many nights sleeping rough. His eyes were what gave him away, though no one in the courtroom knew to look for the signs. Pale blue, nearly gray, they held a steadiness that came not from confidence but from having seen the absolute worst that human beings could do to each other and somehow finding a way to continue existing. They were the eyes of someone who had long ago stopped expecting anything good from the world, but wasn't surprised by its cruelties either. The charges were simple enough. Petty theft, specifically the attempted shoplifting of a candy bar valued at $1.99 from Henderson's Market on Pine Street. The arrest report, filed 3 days earlier by Officer Rebecca Martinez, noted that the defendant had been observed placing a Snickers bar in his jacket pocket and walking toward the exit without paying. When confronted by store security, he had made no attempt to resist or run. He had simply stopped, removed the candy bar from his pocket, and placed it on the counter without a word. Seemed like he was just hungry, Officer Martinez had written in her report, though that observation wouldn't appear in the formal charges. Cooperated fully. No resistance. Appeared to be homeless. Strong body odor, worn clothing, no fixed address provided. The arraignment had been equally straightforward. James Morrison, when asked how he pleaded, had responded in a voice barely above a whisper, "Guilty." His court-appointed attorney, Sarah Chen, an overworked public defender 3 years out of law school, had tried to enter a plea of not guilty on his behalf, but he had shaken his head firmly. "Guilty," he repeated. "I took it." Judge Patricia Holloway, 15 years on the bench, had seen hundreds of cases just like this one. Petty theft, homeless defendant, usually substance abuse involved, though the toxicology report on Morrison had come back clean. The standard sentence would be time served plus community service, maybe a referral to social services if the defendant seemed motivated to accept help. What nobody in that courtroom could have known was that James Morrison's record was clean, not because he was new to trouble, but because his service record was classified at a level that prevented his military decorations from appearing in civilian databases. The Medal of Honor citation that bore his name was filed in a restricted section of the National Archives, accessible only to those with clearance to review classified operations from the Vietnam War. Sarah Chen had tried to engage Morrison in conversation during their brief meeting the previous afternoon. She wanted to explore mitigating circumstances, to build a case for leniency based on his age, his apparent poverty, his lack of criminal history, but Morrison had been uninterested in mitigation. "I took something that wasn't mine," he had told her, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. "That's theft. I'm guilty." "Mr. Morrison," Chen had pressed, "I understand you want to take responsibility, but the court needs to understand your circumstances. Are you receiving any veterans' benefits? Do you have family support? Are there mental health issues we should address? Morrison had looked at her for a long moment, and she had seen something flicker behind those pale eyes. Not anger, exactly, but something harder. I don't need excuses, he had said finally. I did what I did. Now, sitting in the courtroom as the morning session began, Morrison watched Judge Holloway review his file. She was a fair judge, known for her practical approach to sentencing and her genuine concern for defendants who found themselves in her courtroom through circumstances rather than criminality. She looked up from the file, her brown eyes studying Morrison's face. Mr. Morrison, she began, her voice carrying the authority of her position, but tinged with compassion. This appears to be your first offense. The prosecution is recommending time served plus 40 hours of community service. Before I impose sentence, is there anything you'd like to say to the court? Morrison shook his head slowly. No, Your Honor. Judge Holloway frowned slightly. In her experience, defendants usually had something to say at sentencing. An apology, an explanation, a plea for leniency. Morrison's silence was unusual but not unprecedented. She was about to proceed with sentencing when the courtroom door opened. The man who entered moved with a purposefulness that immediately drew attention. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with silver hair cut in a precise military style. His suit was dark blue, well-tailored but not flashy, and he wore it with the kind of bearing that suggested uniform had been his preferred attire for most of his adult life. Most notably, on his lapel, he wore a small pin that would be meaningless to most civilians, but spoke volumes to those who knew how to read military decorations. General William Hayes, United States Army, retired, had driven 6 hours from his home in Sacramento when he received the phone call from his aide, Colonel Patricia Vance. Sir, Vance had said, you're going to want to see this news item I just forwarded to your email. The item had been brief, buried on page 3 of the Riverside County Herald. Local homeless man arrested for shoplifting. The accompanying photograph, grainy and small, showed a man in handcuffs being led to a patrol car. But Hayes had recognized the profile immediately, even after 50 years. The same jawline, the same way of holding his shoulders, even in defeat. James Morrison, Staff Sergeant James Morrison, 173rd Airborne Brigade, Company B, 2nd Battalion. Medal of Honor recipient. The man who had single-handedly held off an enemy force of more than 40 North Vietnamese soldiers while his wounded teammates were evacuated. The man who had bled from 7 different wounds while laying down covering fire that saved not just his squad, but an entire helicopter crew that had been shot down attempting the rescue. Hayes had been a young second lieutenant then, fresh out of West Point, assigned to the 173rd as a platoon leader. He had never served directly with Morrison, but every officer in the brigade knew the story of what happened on March 15, 1969. In a jungle clearing 12 miles northwest of On K. Your Honor, Hayes said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of command. I apologize for the interruption, but I believe there are facts relevant to this case that the court should hear before sentencing. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres, looked up sharply. Irregular interruptions were unusual in his courtroom, and he was about to object when Judge Holloway held up a hand. Sir, she said, this is a sentencing hearing, not a trial. Unless you're here in an official capacity, I'll have to ask you to. I am here in an official capacity, Your Honor. Hayes interrupted gently. Retired General William Hayes, United States Army. I'm here regarding Staff Sergeant James Morrison. A murmur ran through the sparse courtroom. Morrison, who had remained motionless throughout the proceedings, slowly turned his head to look at the man who had spoken his name. When his eyes met Hayes's, something flickered across his weathered features. Not recognition, exactly, but awareness. He knew what was about to happen. Judge Holloway set down her pen. In 15 years on the bench, she had seen enough to know when a case was about to become something other than routine. General Hayes, she said carefully, you may approach the bench. Hayes walked forward with measured steps, stopping at the appropriate distance from the judge's bench. Behind him, the few spectators in the gallery, mostly court employees and a reporter from the local paper who covered the courthouse beat, leaned forward with interest. Your Honor, Hayes began, The man you're about to sentence is Staff Sergeant James Morrison, United States Army, 173rd Airborne Brigade. On March 15, 1969, in the Republic of Vietnam, Staff Sergeant Morrison distinguished himself by acts of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The formal language of military citations carried a weight in the quiet courtroom that made everyone present understand they were hearing something significant. Hayes continued, his voice steady, but carrying an undertone of emotion that spoke to personal knowledge rather than mere recitation. Staff Sergeant Morrison's squad was conducting a reconnaissance patrol when they were ambushed by a superior enemy force. When the squad leader was killed and several team members were wounded, Staff Sergeant Morrison assumed command. Despite being wounded himself, he organized a defensive position and called in helicopter evacuation for the wounded. Morrison sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. His hands, still weathered but steady, remained folded in his lap. When the evacuation helicopter was shot down, attempting to reach his position, Hayes continued, Staff Sergeant Morrison made the decision to leave his defensive position and attempt a rescue of the helicopter crew. Moving across 200 meters of open ground under intense enemy fire, he reached the crashed aircraft and found 3 crew members alive but wounded. Judge Holloway found herself leaning forward, drawn into the narrative despite herself. In the prosecutor's section, Torres had set down his files and was listening with the rapt attention of someone hearing history unfold. For the next 4 hours, Hayes said, Staff Sergeant Morrison held that position alone. Using weapons and ammunition from the downed helicopter, he repelled multiple enemy assaults while tending to the wounded crew members. He was shot 7 times but continued to fight. When ammunition ran low, he used grenades from fallen enemy soldiers to maintain his defense. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even the court reporter, normally focused solely on her transcription machine, was staring at Hayes as he spoke. When relief finally arrived, Hayes concluded, they found Staff Sergeant Morrison unconscious from blood loss but still alive. All 3 helicopter crew members survived because of his actions. The enemy force, which numbered more than 40 soldiers, had been driven off by one man who refused to abandon his fellow Americans. Hayes paused, letting the weight of the story settle over the courtroom. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document. Staff Sergeant Morrison was awarded the Medal of Honor for these actions, he said, handing the document to Judge Holloway. This is a copy of the citation, declassified last year. I served in the same brigade, Your Honor. I know what this man did. Judge Holloway took the document with hands that weren't quite steady. The official seal of the United States Army was clearly visible at the top, along with the distinctive design of the Medal of Honor. She read the citation silently, her expression growing more somber with each line. When she finished reading, she looked up at Morrison, who still hadn't moved or spoken. Mr. Morrison, she said softly, is this accurate? For the first time since entering the courtroom, Morrison lifted his head and looked directly at the judge. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. Why didn't you mention this? Judge Holloway asked. Why didn't your attorney include this in your file? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the same weariness Chen had noted during their brief meeting. Because it was 50 years ago, Your Honor. And it doesn't change the fact that I took something that wasn't mine. The simple honesty of the statement hung in the air. Here was a man who had performed acts of extraordinary heroism, who had literally bled for his country, and who saw no connection between that service and his current circumstances. Judge Holloway felt something twist in her chest, a combination of admiration and heartbreak that made it difficult to speak. General Hayes stepped forward again. Your Honor, if I may, there's something else the court should know. Judge Holloway nodded for him to continue. Staff Sergeant Morrison's Medal of Honor citation was classified for national security reasons related to the specific operation he was supporting. As a result, his military records don't appear in standard veteran benefit databases. Many Medal of Honor recipients from classified operations have fallen through the cracks of the system because their service can't be verified through normal channels. The implication was clear, and Judge Holloway felt a surge of anger at a system that could lose track of its greatest heroes. She looked at Morrison again, seeing him now not as a homeless man who had shoplifted a candy bar, but as someone whose country had failed him as completely as he had once served it. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "are you receiving any veterans' benefits?" Morrison shook his head. "Applied a few times over the years. They always said they couldn't verify my service." The simple statement carried a weight of bureaucratic frustration that made Hayes clench his jaw. He had seen this before. Classified service records creating gaps that left veterans unable to access the benefits they had earned with their blood. "Your Honor," Hayes said, "I've taken the liberty of contacting the Department of Veterans Affairs this morning. With the declassification of Staff Sergeant Morrison's citation, his records can now be properly processed. The VA has committed to expediting his benefits application." Judge Holloway nodded, then turned her attention back to Morrison. "Mr. Morrison, given this new information, the court is prepared to dismiss all charges. You've served your country with extraordinary distinction, and the circumstances that brought you before this court today appear to be the result of systemic failures rather than criminal intent." Morrison looked up at her, confusion evident in his pale eyes. "Ma'am, I still took the candy bar." "Yes," Judge Holloway said gently, "but context matters. You took a $2 item because you were hungry, and you were hungry because the system failed to provide you with the benefits you earned through service that most of us can't even imagine." She turned to address the courtroom at large. "Staff Sergeant Morrison represents the best of American values: courage, selflessness, and an unwavering commitment to protecting others. That he ended up homeless and desperate enough to shoplift speaks to our failures as a society, not to any failure on his part." Torres, the prosecutor, stood up. "Your Honor, the prosecution supports dismissal of all charges." Sarah Chen, Morrison's public defender, also stood. "The defense is grateful for the court's consideration and General Hayes' intervention." But Morrison himself remained seated, looking troubled. Judge Holloway noticed his expression and leaned forward. "Mr. Morrison, you seem upset by the court's decision. Can you tell me why?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Because it feels like I'm getting away with something because of what I did 50 years ago. And what I did 50 years ago, I didn't do it to get special treatment later. I did it because it was right." The honesty of the statement silenced the courtroom. Here was a man who genuinely couldn't see the connection between his heroic service and society's obligation to care for him. General Hayes stepped forward again. "Staff Sergeant Morrison," he said, using the formal address deliberately, "may I approach?" Morrison nodded, and Hayes walked to the defendant's table. When he reached Morrison, he did something that surprised everyone in the courtroom. He came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. "On behalf of the men you saved that day, and all the men and women who served with you, thank you." Morrison looked up at the general for a long moment. Then slowly he stood and returned the salute with precision that spoke to muscle memory ingrained over decades. When he lowered his hand, his eyes were wet. "They were good soldiers," Morrison said quietly. "They deserve to go home." "So did you," Hayes replied, "and so do you now." Judge Holloway watched the exchange with tears in her eyes. She had presided over thousands of cases, but she knew she would remember this moment for the rest of her life. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "the charges against you are dismissed. General Hayes, I understand you've made arrangements regarding Mr. Morrison's benefits?" "Yes, Your Honor. The VA has confirmed that his benefits will be processed immediately. In the meantime, I've arranged temporary housing and have established a fund to ensure his immediate needs are met." Morrison turned to look at Hayes, confusion evident on his weathered features. "Sir, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," Hayes interrupted gently. "We all do. You should never have been in a position where you needed to steal food. That's on us, not on you." Outside the courthouse, the autumn rain had stopped and weak sunlight was breaking through the clouds. Morrison stood on the courthouse steps, breathing deeply for the first time in years. Hayes waited beside him, understanding that this moment required patience. "Sir," Morrison said finally, I need you to know something. What's that? That day in Vietnam, I wasn't thinking about being a hero. I was just thinking about getting everyone home. Hayes nodded. That's what made you one. 3 months later, James Morrison stood in his new apartment, looking out the window at a view that included trees and birds instead of alleyways and concrete. The VA benefits had come through as promised, providing him with housing, medical care, and a monthly stipend that ensured he would never again be hungry enough to steal food. General Hayes had become a regular visitor, sometimes bringing other veterans who had served in Vietnam. They would sit in Morrison's small living room, sharing stories and ensuring that he remained connected to the brotherhood that had sustained him through the worst moments of his life. The local newspaper had run a follow-up story about Morrison's case, leading to an outpouring of support from the community. Henderson's Market, where he had been arrested, had issued a public apology and established a fund for homeless veterans. Morrison had accepted the apology, but declined the special treatment. "I'll pay for what I take," he had said simply, "same as everyone else." Morrison received a visit from Colonel Robert Thorne from the Medal of Honor Society. Thorne explained how Morrison had fallen through the cracks and invited him to their annual convention. "There are 67 living Medal of Honor recipients," Thorne said. "You're one of only 104 who made it home from Vietnam. That makes you part of a very small brotherhood." 6 months later, Morrison attended the convention in Washington, meeting other recipients and sharing his story. What surprised him most was how normal they all seemed. They talked about their families, their jobs, their hobbies. They were ordinary men who had done extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Morrison became involved in the Society's research project to identify other lost recipients. His advocacy led to policy changes at the VA and congressional hearings on veteran records management. 23 other recipients were found and assisted through his efforts. A year after his arrest, Morrison returned to Henderson's Market as a guest speaker at a veteran appreciation event. The teenager who had been working during his arrest asked him, "When everything was bad, how did you keep going?" Morrison thought carefully. "I had memories of men who didn't get the chance to keep going, who died young in Vietnam. I figured as long as I was breathing, I owed it to them to keep trying." Morrison's story became a symbol of resilience and the importance of veteran advocacy. He testified before Congress, published a book, and established a foundation to prevent veteran homelessness. The man who had once been arrested for stealing candy became a national voice for forgotten veterans. But for Morrison, the most important lesson was simple. He had kept going when giving up would have been easier. He maintained his dignity when the world tried to strip it away. And he found a way to use his pain to help others avoid similar suffering. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear orange jumpsuits and steal candy bars because they're hungry. But they remain heroes because of how they respond to circumstances, with dignity, determination, and commitment to helping others. James Morrison had responded by turning his struggle into advocacy for forgotten veterans. The hero who saved 7 men in Vietnam spent his later years saving others in America. The mission never really ended, it just took a different form. This story was brought to you by Warrior Voice. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never gave up, even when everything seemed hopeless? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.